Hello and welcome to the Chaos Destruction Guide for the Procedural City Generator 1.2.1. In this guide, we'll go over how to enable destruction for your city, how to destroy the buildings by doing damage, both direct and radial damage. Then we are going to create a new building from scratch and prepare it so we can destroy it. And then finally, we'll see how we can cache that simulation for better performance. So I'm going to go ahead and move this to my other screen. And now we jump into Unreal and you can see that I have a new basic level that I've created. I've created a new city and called it Chaosville. And it just has two different roads here in between these connectors. One commercial zone and one residential zone. And right off the bat, if I just click play and use my left mouse button, you can see that we can shoot these little projectiles. And if I go into my first person mode by clicking tab, I can actually aim my projectiles, but nothing seems to happen. And that is because even though the buildings in PCG are configured to be destructible, by default, they are disabled. So the first thing you'll notice is that if you select one of the buildings here, we'll go to the details panel, we collapse default scene root. Now you see that we have a component called comp make destructible. And if you click on the component, we have a bunch of different settings here under setup. If we expand general, you see that we have a boolean called active. By default, all of the buildings are inactive. You don't want to have buildings be destroyed just because they receive damage. So you have to be purposeful here. You can click on active. We're simply going to hit play, and remember that this is now the building that is enabled. So we're just going to hit play here. And we're going to go into first person mode, and we're just going to start hitting building. And you can see that we hear a destruction sound. The building is destroyed, and you can hear some sound. You can see that we have some fire particles that spawn. So we have a bunch of debris, and then after a little bit, I believe the default is 30 seconds, that debris will despawn. You can see that we destroyed the building by hitting it several times, and there you go. And you can see that we still have some of that particle effects that are still staying for a little bit longer, and then eventually they will also despawn. So that's great. That's literally all we need to do once everything is configured if you want to make it destructible. Now there is another way, a better way, I guess, if you want to make your entire city destructible, and that is by going into a UI, clicking on the buildings tab, and you'll notice down here there's a chaos destruction section, and there's just two buttons, on and off. So right now everything is supposedly off except for this building. So now we're going to click on. And if you have the show stats, you'll see that we have a message saying chaos destruction on. Now, just with the click of one button, now we can go, and I'm going to go into first person mode here, and we can destroy basically any building here. Go here, and you can see that we have some shaders compiling. That's because, there you go. Notice that we also have some props that were spawned inside. Those props automatically generate, simulate physics. So also notice that this home has a random material applied. It was supposed to be white, but in this case it spawned as this little beige button here. And now when we destroy it, notice that the building that is used to be destroyed also uses the same material. And we're going to show you exactly how to do just that. Okay, let's go ahead and exit there. And that is how you make your city destructible. Now we talked about how you destroy the building, and obviously that is doing damage. This component listens to any damage that the building, the owner, receives. So right now, if you go to Procedural City, Blueprints, and Damage, you see that we have two different blueprints here that are set up to do damage. BB projectile, that's the one we are already firing from our player character. And we have a BP radial damage, which by the name I'm sure you figured out does obviously radial damage. So we'll drag it into our scene here, and we're going to put it up a little bit higher here. And if we go into the setup here, we see that we have a bunch of options. It is active by default, and it simulates physics, meaning that it's going to fall. Then it's going to do damage on this radius, which is 10,000, and a base damage of 50. Now, by default, all of the buildings are configured to have an HP of 20, meaning that 50 will instantly destroy any building that has a lower base HP. So keep that in mind. If some buildings in your city are configured to have higher base damage, this will do the damage, but it will not destroy the building. You have something else as well called the object impulse, which we'll see in just a second, with a tag list here, and a bunch of other options like Z-force and directional magnitude, etc. So let's go ahead and see what happens if we just click simulate. So go ahead and click here and simulate, and you'll see that we have the radial damage fall, and immediately a bunch of buildings on the radius take damage and are instantly destroyed, as you can see here. And if we zoom in here, we see that just as expected, all the buildings spawn their particles, and they're actually playing sounds as well. And we can actually debug the radius. So if we click the blueprint here again and go down here, we can say debug damage radius, and that's going to help us visualize exactly the area where the blueprint will do damage. And you can see here is a circle here, and all of these homes that were marked here received damage. Now, something else that I wanted to include on this is the ability to affect other objects that are non-destructible by applying an impulse. And this is where this object impulse value comes in. You have an impulse value and you have an object tag list. So any object with any of these tags, and you can add as many tags as you want, will receive that impulse. By default, it's configured to work on any prop in foliage for PCG. So let's go ahead and go to Procedural City, Meshes, and let's do, let's see, what else can we have? Actually, Procedural City, let's do Epic Content, then we do Meshes, we'll do Environment, and we'll have like this pine tree here. We'll just do a few pine trees and some of these buildings here. And then let's go up to Meshes, and let's do something else. Let's see Props. Let's see road props here. Sure, maybe like this trash can or something. Doesn't really matter what it is. We can do this little mailbox here, and maybe like this trash. And right now nothing will happen because they don't have the proper tags. But if I go there and I select, for example, the trash, the pine tree, the building tree. Actually, let's just do the trees first. These two, and we're going to add a tag. So we go there and add PCG foliage. And then for the other ones, this one right here, maybe this mailbox here, and maybe this little trash, we're going to add PCG prop. And all we need to do now is, now we have this configured, is we can just quickly duplicate these trees here. And now let's go ahead and simulate and see what happens here. And you can see that not only were the buildings destroyed, but all of these props were kind of blown away, so to speak, from the epicenter of the damage outward. You can see that they've been knocked down, including all of the foliage here. This guy wasn't affected, it seems. And I can't find the trash bags. Oh, there we go. There's some here and here. But you can see the effect. So obviously you have the ability to affect props, and you have the ability to affect buildings, and you can add as many tags as you wish here for objects to be affected. And just to close off this section for the damage, I've also included the same blueprint that you can spawn now from the Cessna and the helicopter. So actually, let's make this inactive so it doesn't fall. And let's click play here. And I'm just going to go inside the helicopter, stop the music. I'm going to just fly over the same area here. And you can see on the menu I have that F is for fire, and you're going to simply spawn one of those blueprints, and as soon as it hits the floor, it'll apply that radial damage and impulse. Okay, and for this section of the video, we are going to go through the entire process by taking a new building and making it destructible. And you can see here that I did a little bit of preparation before starting this section of the video. And I created a new building blueprint, so you can see here. And it's a building that is not included by default with the procedural city generator. However, this building, along many other ones, is actually available for free as an additional download from the same creator that did all of the buildings that do come with PCG. I'm going to leave a link in the description below. If you like to follow along, you can go ahead and download the project and then migrate that specific building. So what I did is, as I opened that project, I found this specific building, this villa that I really like, and I migrated the static mesh along with all of its materials. And then as you can see here, I created a building blueprint based on that static mesh. So if we open the static mesh itself, you can see here, I'm going to zoom out. You can see that it is a villa and it has several different material slots. Now, typically in PCG, we want to add additional variety per building type by changing some material IDs based on a seed. And that happens by default on all of the buildings that you spawn that come with PCG. So since we're setting this up first, we want to make sure that we do the same thing just to make it consistent. So if you open your building here, you'll see that we have several different material slots, and we can quickly see which materials correspond to what by using the little isolate checkbox here. So if I click on element 0 and click on isolate, you see that this material corresponds to everything that you see that is visible here. It's actually a little bit more complex because it has textures and it's all packed very nicely here. If I isolate element 1, for example, you'll see that we have just these areas here, and you can keep going, element 2, element 3, etc. So for this example, we'll use element 1, just going to make it very obvious when we randomize that material, and that's going to be these edges here. By default, it has this Trespa white material, and we can make it change to a different material at runtime to add some variety. So we'll do element 1. And actually, I've already done that. So if I select my blueprint here, go to the details panel under setup, there will be a random material list. And if I expand that, we can add as many indexes as we want. So for this specific entry, I've already decided that we are going to use material index 1, which again, if I go back to the static mesh, corresponds to this, right? So I want to make sure that you understand the link here. And then element 1, index 1, and I am going to replace that with one of these random materials. So you can see that I've included the Trespa white material, that is the original one, but I also have this kind of beige plaster. And just to make it really obvious, I added this like really bright red. So what happens is, if I click simulate now, you'll see that that edge index 1 has chosen this red color here. You can add many more indexes and many more colors here. There's no limitation. And as soon as you drop this here, based on the seed that is randomly chosen every time a building is spawned, you're going to get a different result. But I think I like this right now because we have some white here, and as soon as we simulate, we are now using that kind of bright red. Another thing I did here, and you can see at the bottom here, is I added some interior props very quickly. I didn't populate the whole house, and we can do that if we go all the way down here. You can see that I already added the interior class, which is going to be right there. And if I go down here and click spawn interior blueprint, we actually spawn the interior blueprint here. And if I click simulate, you'll see that already, I'm going to zoom on here, you can see that I added some couches here, a little bookshelf, a plant, and then this little statue here at the base of the stairs. And if you have any questions about how I did this, there is an actual video where I go over the entire process of how to create your interiors. It's quite detailed. It is still valid for this version of PCG. Okay, and now that we have a new building with random materials and an interior, we are now ready to start fracturing this mesh and creating the destructible component. Actually, one more thing I do recommend is that you convert your static mesh to Nanite. That's actually what I just did. You can right click your static mesh and you can go to the Nanite section and enable the Nanite checkbox. Now, if you recall, we were going back to the static mesh editor here and we were clicking on isolate. That only works if your static mesh is not Nanite enabled. So you can see here that I enabled Nanite, and now if I click on isolate, nothing changes. So if you're trying to follow along with the video and for some reason this is not working, it is because you have a Nanite enabled mesh. So you could disable Nanite until you find the right ID, configure the blueprint, and then enable Nanite. Something else you should keep in mind is that Nanite does not support translucent materials, which is why I have a special material that I use that is fully transparent and it doesn't have that translucency. It's a mask material. So if you're using PCG, you can replace your window materials with MI window glass standard and it'll look almost the same except that it's just fully transparent. Alright, so now with that out of the way, we are ready to create our destructible mesh. So Unreal Engine's chaos system doesn't actually fracture static meshes. It has a separate asset type called a geometry collection, and we must first create it and then we can fracture it. So let's quickly, just to make things organized, let's create a new folder here. I'm going to call it building, and I'm just going to move all of those blueprints that are building related here just to keep things a little bit simpler. And now we are going to, let's just move here, going back into this folder and take the actual static mesh, not the blueprint, drag it to our level here. And with the static mesh selected, we are going to click on the mode selection here and go into fracture. And it looks kind of funky because I have this PCG thing. So I'm just going to close this for now. We don't need it. And with this selected, we are going to click on new under generate. And this will create a new geometry collection. And in this case, I'm going to the same folder called destruction here. And I'm going to call this GC for geometry collection building _ tutorial. And I'm going to click create geometry collection. So if I go all the way up here, you see that now we have a new asset type called geometry collection. And this is the asset type that we are going to fracture. Notice that we have an issue here because geometry collections also have issues with masked and translucent materials. So we're going to fix that in just a second. But now that we're here in this mode, you can see that now we have all of the different fracture modes available to us. This is where the artistic piece comes into play. If you want to make it fracture in a very realistic manner, you may want to select different fracture modes, configure the tool, and have all these different layers. For this video though, we're going to keep it very simple, and we're just going to select uniform, and we're going to do between 20 and 20, which is fine, and we're going to click fracture. All right, and now that it's fractured, you can see that we have a new level here. Level 0 has one piece or one fracture, one part. Level 1 has 69. And if you come here to the explode amount and you start moving this, you can see what that looks like. Let's do one more level. We're going to leave the exact same settings and click on fracture again. Okay. And now we're finished. You see that we have on level 2 227 pieces. And again, if you explode, you can see that we have a lot more granularity here. You can also select the fracture level to view. So if you wanted to just view level 2, for example, you can see what that looks like. Or level 1, you can see what that looks like. Or level 0, which is nothing, and all. All right, we're going to leave it there. Again, if you want to really understand how to use this, there are plenty of tutorials that explain and documentation that explain what all of these different tools do. And I would suggest that you actually spend the time to make a proper fracture so the building looks good when you're destroying it. We're going to exit the fracture mode, go back to selection mode. I'm just going to click save all so we can save our level and our geometry collection. And now we're going to open the asset. I'm going to maximize it here, and we're going to do two things. We are going to the damage thresholds here, and I personally like to make this a little bit smaller. So I'm just going to remove 1 0 from each level here. All right, and now we're going to go to the materials here and expand the materials section. And you'll notice that we have repeated materials. And that is because for every material, you can specify a quote-unquote interior material or inside material. So for example, if you have this white trespa, which is index 1, which is now index 2 and 3, you can specify an interior material that looks different than the outside material. So notice that every index has been duplicated. So if we go back here, index 0, which is this right here, is now index 0 and 1. Index 1, which is the one that we are using to change the material and add randomness, has now converted into 2 and 3. And the window material here, which is element 4, I'm sure you guessed it here, is now 8 and 9. So look how it's basically duplicating it. So now, unfortunately, this is not compatible with the geometry collection. You need a solid material. So what I do for now is, if you go back here, is we'll find the material that looks closest to a wall color, for example. And in this case, I'm just going to use this kind of white material here, which is that white trespa material. So I'm just going to replace it here. All right, and we're going to click save. And let's go back to the level. And you'll see that it doesn't look like anything has updated. So what you can do is you can just kind of remove the asset and bring it back into the level. And you can see that now it has updated. So it just takes a second there. And again, it's not ideal, but this will only be shown in this form for a split second before it starts crumbling. So that is, again, a limitation with the system itself. You can add any other material that looks better and approximates the windows in this case. All right, the next step is to go back to our blueprint building here. And we're going to configure a special geometry collection class. So if I click here on the building itself, and we scroll all the way down here on the components to component make destructible, you'll see that we have under general a building GC class, and it's obviously empty. And if I click here, you'll see that we have a bunch of different classes. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the base blueprint here, and then I'm going to navigate to this place by clicking browse to asset. And I'm going to create a child blueprint. Create child blueprint class. And this is going to be the class where we are hosting our geometry collection. So I'm going to just name this GC tutorial. And I can now move this with the others to that destruction folder. Move here. And we go back to the folder, and now we have this GC class underscore tutorial. We're going to double click and open it. And now here, we're going to select the geometry collection component itself. And we're going to click here on the geometry collection, keep it selected. Go back to our class, and here with geometry collection selected, we come here to rest collection, and we're going to click on this little arrow here. That is the selected building. And now if we scroll out, we can see that we have the full building with all of the materials exactly how we configured it. Go ahead and click compile, save, and we can just close this up. And we can close the geometry collection as well. Now we go back to our level, and we have our class configured correctly. So now with our building selected, we go back to comp make destructible, and under general and building CG class, we're going to select our CG class here. We can now click on the little arrow here and replace the base class, which we weren't going to use anyway, with our tutorial class. And now let's go ahead and remove this. Actually, we don't need to remove it. We can just leave it there. And now with this selected, we can now click on, actually, before we do that, we want to activate it. So let's go back to comp make destructible and make this active right here. And you can see that the HP is 20. We can just make it 10 just to make it easier for us to destroy it. And we're going to click play. And you can see that right there, the right hand side automatically destroyed itself because of course it did. But we're concerned here with the left hand side. We have the class. You can see that the interior spawned normally. I'm going to now start damaging our blueprint, and I want you to see what happens when I do that. There we go. We have now destroyed our building, but I don't know if you noticed something. As soon as it got replaced with the class, this border here, which is white by default, and when we click play was this red, was not present in our destructible geometry collection. And that is because we did not configure it. So that is, I wanted to make sure that we kind of showed that. So let's just remove this. It's kind of being distracted here. So let's go back here, click on our building, go down to comp make destructible, and under general, you'll see that we have material indexes. And we're going to match the exact same settings that we have for our building. So we know now that if we go there, we have a building index, and that building index is going to be index 1, right? We talked about that. But now we have different indexes that are going to be copied for the geometry collection itself. So if I click here, you'll notice that we have now just a list of indexes. And actually, let me just open the geometry collection again. We know that index 1 has now converted to index 2 and 3. Remember that we are duplicating those materials. So what I want to add into the component is index 2 and 3, which correspond to index 1 here. And that is exactly what we'll do. And now that we have this information, what the component will do is, as soon as it spawns our class, GC class, it'll copy whatever material was in index 1, which is going to be the random red, and copy it and replace it in index 2 and 3 of the geometry collection, and then destroy it. So again, in this case, we have white. Let's just do it again. Let me just change it to red. I want to make sure that I make it really, really obvious here. So the way this is happening is by using a seed. So you can always go back here and click randomize seed, and we'll just find one until we hit. Oh, okay, fine. We'll use this one. There you go. And now you see that we have the beige color here, or this is the red. We'll destroy the geometry collection. And notice now that the geometry collection was using the correct materials. That is how you normally set up the destruction component. And really quickly here, I'm going to select the comp make destructible. You can see that we have many different options here. Obviously the active and inactive, that's going to make sure that it can be destroyed. The building HP, this is just regular damage. You can debug the HP. If I select this, every time the building is hit, it'll print the actual quote-unquote HP of the building. Under the destruction tab, you can see that we can play around with the radial magnitude and directional magnitude. So what actually happens is when the building is destroyed, a field, a physics field, is actually spawned at the hit location that strains all of the pieces in the geometry collection and forces them to break. So you can configure how big is that radial magnitude and the directional magnitude. By default, I'm including 2 different explosion sounds that are going to be used. One of them will be used, so it's randomly selected. So if you have a better sound for a specific building, say you have something that has glass or something, you can just quickly add it here and replace the kind of the generic ones that I have here. You have the option to destroy the debris or the fractures after a certain amount of time, and you can also spawn the props. So destroy debris is, do you want to remove the fractured pieces? I would obviously recommend that you do that, and if you have that selected, it'll use this despawn delay that you have 30 seconds by default. After 30 seconds, those pieces will be despawned. The spawn props section here means that if you have a building that, let's say you destroyed from far, the props have not spawned, this will force all of the props to spawn, and then it'll make sure that they simulate physics, and then will destroy the building. A better example would be a building here like the one in the background that's really tall. Even if your player is near the bottom of the building, the top floors will not be loaded. But if you have this selected spawn props, it'll actually force every single floor to load, all of the props of the entire building to load. It'll make sure that they all simulate physics, then it'll destroy the geometry collection, and you'll see all of those props fly about. This makes it a lot more realistic, but much more expensive to simulate, so keep that in mind. You have other options here like emitters. You have the option to have Niagara or cascade emitters. In this case, I have two types of emitters. I have a fire and a smoke, and yet again, there will be randomly spawned just to give it a little bit more visual flair. You see that we have a scale range for the emitters. So it'll be between min and max. So it'll scale between 2 times the size to 6 times the size. And there's going to be a number of these emitters that will spawn between 4 and 8. And you also have separate despawn timers here between 45 seconds in this case and 60 seconds. So by default, the debris will despawn in 30 seconds, and then you'll have between 15 to 30 more seconds of the little fire and smoke that will appear there. I'm also spawning a slip field at the bottom of the building, and what that field does is as soon as a fracture piece hits that field, it'll stop simulating, making the destruction a little bit cheaper. I would leave this on by default. It just makes the destruction cheaper. But if you really want maximum realism, or you want the player to be able to hit those pieces, then you can disable this and they'll continue to simulate as they're on the floor. In this section, we'll learn how to use the Chaos Cache Manager. Caching means that we're saving the fracture simulation so it can be played back with less cost at a later time. So what I've done here is I selected a bunch of buildings that were here, you can see them here, and I moved them back so we can focus only on these 8 buildings. I'm going to zoom here. I also added a radial damage blueprint that is obviously going to fall and destroy all of these buildings. However, you'll notice that performance can be an issue if you have a lot of destruction going on. So I'm going to click here and enable show FPS. That will give you a quick idea of what's happening as soon as we start destruction. So if we click on simulate here, see what happens. Notice that the editor freezes for a second there, and then it immediately starts destroying. We are right now around 12 to 15 frames per second, and as things are simulating, and eventually it'll get back to 27, 28, 30. As all of these fracture points start resting at the bottom, you'll see that we're going to go up and up. And eventually about 30 seconds later, when everything despawns, then we'll go back to our regular frame rate. There you go. So you can see as things start despawning, we are now back to, close to 90-some%. And eventually things like this will despawn and we'll be back to where we were before. A quicker way of visualizing that, and I always like doing that, is I'm going to quickly deactivate here and just click play, is that I like to use the command, and you click tilde stat unit. And I like to use the one stat unit graph. And you can see that now, not only do we have the FPS, but we have the frame time, game time, draw, GPU, etc. And we have a little graph at the bottom left corner that will show us exactly what's happening. So if we again, I'm gonna enable this and click on simulate, you can see now on the left hand side what's happening. You can see that the editor literally freezes for a second, and look how much time is taking us to process all that destruction. So obviously in a real game you wouldn't want this happening because it's going to tag the FPS. So this is when caching comes into play. What we can do is we can simulate here in the editor and save the simulation into a little cache file that is actually inside the project, and then we can play it back later on command, so we can actually save quite a bit of performance. And the way you do that is that you can select one or more actors here, and you click on actor, chaos, and you will click on create cache manager. Don't do that yet though. The problem is that the cache manager expects an actor that has a geometry collection inside of it, but our buildings by default don't have the geometry collection. As we just learned, when this building is quote unquote destroyed, what happens is that we spawn a second class, a geometry collection class, that then is destroyed. So if we just use our buildings as is, this is not going to work. So what we could do is we could select each individual building, we click on comp make destructible, and you can see that we have a few things here. We can actually click on show geometry collection. And what happens here is, I'm gonna look at this building here, is if I click show geometry collection, you can see that the actual geometry collection class is now spawned. And now with this class that actually has the geometry collection selected, we could now go into actor, chaos, and create cache manager. However, that's kind of annoying because you have to select each individual building, collapse this, click on the component, and then click on show geometry collection. So there's actually an easier way. So let's go back, click on our building, make, oops, not this one, but the actual building here. We're going to comp make destructible, show building mesh, and you can see that now we are back to where we were. And now, instead of doing it manually, we're going to use a separate blueprint. So let's go back to Procedural City, Blueprints, and then we go to Buildings, and then we go to Destruction, and we have a blueprint called BP Destruction Cache Manager. And that blueprint is going to make our lives a lot easier if we're trying to cache our simulation. So go ahead and grab it, and we're going to drop it here. We're going to rotate right here our actor, and we have two different volumes, one called the detection volume and one called the activation volume. So we're going to grab the activation volume right here, and we're going to drag it and rotate it to try to encircle or overlap all of the buildings that we want to detect. And you can go here under volumes, and for the detection volume, we're going to change the scale to something like 100 to 100. And now we can get it in a way that it overlaps all of our buildings. It doesn't have to be exact. As long as the trace hits the building, then we can do what we need to do. So in this case, you see that the activation volume is now overlapping all of our buildings. And now with this selected, now we can go all the way down and click Show Geometry Collections. Give it a second. And now you see that every single building that was there is now showing the geometry collection. One more thing is that for the cache manager to work, we want to obviously destroy the buildings. So right now, if we plan to destroy the building, we can click Simulate, and this radial blueprint will fall and destroy the geometry collections. But let's say that you wanted to destroy the buildings in a different way. You could also hit play and destroy them with your player, or you can have the buildings auto-destroy. So I'm going to click on radial damage here and deactivate this blueprint. then I'm going back to the destruction cache manager, and there is an additional option called enable damage from start. You can see they have a little message here. And what happens is when I click on simulate, the building would basically auto-destruct. It'll spawn a field that would destroy the building at the building's origin. And you can see that now the buildings are being destroyed automatically. This isn't ideal though, because it'll basically be destroyed at the base of the building. So if you wanted something very specific, maybe the buildings are destroyed from above or something, this is not ideal, but it is an option. So you have the option of doing it automatically, which we will not do. We'll click on disable damage from start. And in this case, we want to simulate this falling and actually damaging. So we'll go back here and we'll click on activate. And now we want to be able to record that. So we're going to select all of our geometry collection buildings. And notice that we have the building GC class selected. With all of these buildings selected, now we go to actor, chaos, create cache manager. And you'll see automatically that we want to create a new cache collection. So we're going to go to procedural city, tutorials, destruction. We'll just create it there. And we can name it whatever we want. New chaos cache collection. We'll just click save. Doesn't matter. And now if I go back to that folder here, you see that we have a physical asset that will record all the destruction from all of the fracturing that is going to happen. We also have a cache manager. So if we click here on and type cache, notice that we have an actual cache manager. This is a class native to Unreal that will be recording the destruction, and this is experimental. So right in here, I am using Unreal Engine 5.1, which is the baseline class. It may look a little different if you're doing 5.2, 5.3, but the functionality would still be the same. So what we want to do is want to make sure that we go here and the cache mode is set to record. Meaning that as soon as we hit play or simulate, this blueprint will start recording the destruction of all of the components that are being washed. And you can see here that it's observing 8 components, which is the 8 buildings that we selected. And if we expand here, you see that each individual one is given a cache name and a bunch of components. So now what we want to do is we want to simulate. Click on simulate, and now you'll see that our radial damage blueprint will fall. And you can see that we have very bad performance, which is fine. As soon as it falls, the buildings are going to start destroying themselves here. And we'll leave it as is. All right. And now we're going to stop. And now we've captured that destruction inside our Chaos Cache Manager, which is recording that information on the cache collection there. Now we want to change the cache mode into play, meaning that we're now going to play this destruction, and we can do a start mode, which is timed or triggered. So for now, if we leave it at timed, when we click on simulate, and actually let's go ahead and disable this. And now if we click simulate, let's see what happens. You give it a second, and then notice that our buildings are now being destroyed, and our performance is actually much better than it was before. Because what we're doing is basically we are playing the simulation back by using the cache manager. Notice that nothing really destroyed it, we just saved that destruction. So we're going to click on stop, and you could leave it there if you wanted this to play exactly as soon as the game starts. But typically what you'll want to do is you want to have a trigger or trigger that destruction whenever you want. So instead of the start mode being timed, we can use triggered. And now I'm sure you'll realize what's going to happen. If I click simulate, nothing really happens because it's waiting to be triggered. And this is when my blueprint comes into play. So let's go back and click on BP Destruction Cache. And we'll leave volumes here for now. Actually, you'll see that we have an activation volume. So the activation volume, as it sounds, is going to activate that destruction. So I'm going to move it here, and I'm going to make sure that you can actually, going back to volumes, the volumes are not hidden because I want to make sure that I can see them. So we'll deselect hidden. And now under cache manager, we want to make sure that we select the cache manager that we have on the level. And we have a trigger method, which is going to be either trigger all or trigger from cache name. So we'll do trigger all for now. And now we are going to hit play. And again, nothing happens, but look what happens as soon as I enter this volume here. It'll actually play the destruction that we saved on that cache. And one last thing that I do want to mention here is if you click on the cache manager itself, you'll notice that each individual observed component has a cache name. So we can actually use these cache names to trigger specific destruction. So we'll just use the first one here. We'll just kind of copy this cache name. And we'll go back to the destruction cache. This is the blueprint that comes with PCG. And here for trigger method, we'll go from trigger all to trigger from cache names. And then we'll add the cache name here, which we copied exactly the same as we had from this blueprint. So we'll click on play. And then we are going to go on the volume here. And notice that we're only triggering the destruction for this building right here. So again, this system is still experimental. As you can see, it's not 100% reliable, but it is usable as of 5.1. I believe the Unreal Engine team will probably continue working on this and making it better. So maybe in the future, you won't even need my special blueprint, but at least for now, if you have really big destruction that's happening, you now have the ability to cache it and play it back. All right, that is going to cover it for this guide. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave your comments in the video, or if you want to ask me something directly, go ahead and join our Discord server and ask your questions there. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you in the next video.